when a military court ordered that Joseph Smith and the 6 other prisoners all be taken and summarily shot. To his eternal credit, Brigadier General Alexander Doniphan, he cried out against the commanding officer, "It is cold-blooded murder. I will not obey your order, and if you execute these men, I will hold you responsible, so help me God." In showing such courage and integrity, Doniphan not only saved the lives of these 7 men, but endeared himself forever to Latter-day Saints in every generation.
So who was this brigadier general who threw himself in front of a firing squad to save Joseph Smith? Well, he is the law partner to General Atchison, later on a senator, who was known as a Missouri ruffian or a bloody assassin, claimed to want to kill or assassinate every abolitionist found in the state of the Missouri, including, as we shall see, Joseph Smith. Let's hear what Wikipedia has to say about General Atchison and his law partner Doniphan. In Kansas, border ruffians was the name applied to pro-slavery settlers from the slave state of Missouri. Armed ruffians interfered in territorial elections and attacked the free state settlements. The ruffians were driven by leaders such as U.S. Senator David Rice Atchison. Yes. Attorney for the Quorum of the 12, U.S. Senator David Wright Atchison, law partner to General Doniphan, called Northerners Negro thieves and abolitionist tyrants. Atchison, law partner General Doniphan, encouraged Missourians to defend their institution with the bayonet and with blood, and if necessary to kill every goddamn abolitionist in the district. What motivated them was hatred of the Yankees and abolitionists and fear of free blacks living nearby. This is who Jeffery Holland is blubbering over. General Atchison and his law partner, General Doniphan, both of whom served as Joseph Smith attorneys to ensure Joseph Smith was not given adequate representation, but conducted a complete kangaroo court. Yes, General Doniphan and General Atchison, loyal to Governor Boggs, were involved in a criminal conspiracy to set up the Smith brothers for treason and near execution, at which Doniphan heroically interferes and saves Joseph Smith in the nick of time. Wrong. This was pure military theater. They always expected to release Joseph Smith as soon as all the Mormons were exiled and run from the state, so the border ruffians, including General Atchison and General Doniphan, could loot the wealth of the exiting Mormons. This is a fun romp, listening to the drama queen, Jeffery Holland, sniffle his way through the embarrassment of what I identify as the Quorum of the 12's first bungled attempt to murder Joseph Smith, Jr. Who were the Joseph Smith and Hyrum Smith's persecutors? Well, no one less esteemed than the Quorum of the 12. Yes, those rascally rabbits, Brigham Young and his brigade of brigands, called the Quorum of the 12. Smith's arrest in the Hallmark card version of what is known as the Missouri Mormon War, which was a few weeks of armed struggle during the years of 1838 between Mormons and the Missouri militias. Mormons were fighting for the right to live, vote, and settle among the predominantly white settlers in the Missouri Territory. The old settlers, as the locals were called, lived in sparse settlements around meager town centers, which may have only a post office, but certainly at least 3 or 4 salons, as was Gallatin. The Mormon influx brought not only interracial inhabitants of Native Americans, whom some of the local settlers suspected were free blacks posing as the lighter-skinned indigenous, but also the rapid infrastructure and construction of the large planned communities by these Mormon settlers. Evidence suggests it was Jeffery Holland and his ancestor brothers in Missouri who were responsible for setting up the arrest, the near execution, and incarceration of the Smiths. The court transcripts reveal how the so-called Missouri Mormon leadership, en masse and in lockstep, testified in the most outrageous manner against the Smiths, What Holland and the Mormon memory fails to disclose is that it was the Missouri Mormons who singularly were responsible for subsequently setting up Smith for his near execution, after which these Mormons systematically testified against Smith at his trial for treason. Without the inflammatory accusations against Smith by the entire Mormon Missouri leadership, there would have been no case against the Smiths. Jeffery Holland's band of brothers, the former Quorum of the 12, scapegoated Joseph Smith and Hyrum Smith for treason. But in the 1838 Missouri trial, every witness for the prosecution were no less than all these Missouri Mormon leadership who eventually formed the original Quorum of the 12. The Missouri trial transcripts show that the witnesses against the Smiths spun outrageous tales condemning Smith in an elaborate conspiracy to overthrow the United States and anoint himself as king of the world in what was going to be called Kingdom of God. Sound familiar? Phelps, Page, and others testify how Smith had men's also testified in elaborate detail about the Smith conspiracy to overthrow the United States. The Missouri Mormon witnesses against Smith for treason and execution were no less, let's name them again, Orson Pratt, John Page, W. Phelps, and John Corrill. These traitors to human decency are celebrated today as good Mormons. My, what evil can lurk in the hearts of man. Here is the sad paradox. Mormon infiltrators known as the Danite assassins, like John D. Lee, who was a friend and called Lilburn Boggs his first mentor and employer, later transferring this loyalty to Brigham Young, tells in his Confessions of a Danite how it was the Mormons who ignited the war in Missouri through a classic false flag operation at the voting polls in Gallatin. A false flag operation is one in which the victim actually is the perpetrator and then wails about being a victim, just simply used to cause a greater conflict, which this was calculated to do. In his confession, Lee recounts how he was strategically placed outside the polls before the voting began. Lee then watched as a known Mormon attempted to vote, was blocked by whom he thought was a local Missourian. After a scuffle broke out, this apparent violent Missourian identified himself as a Mormon to Lee through a secret hand sign. Lee had just been taught in a secret initiation Mormon Danite meeting that had occurred after a general conference in Daviess County. The fact that the Mormons were called out to incite the conflict by assuming roles of Mormons and Missourians is an example of the classic false flag operation. Lee recounts how after the scuffle, where men were fighting with long sticks, after the scuffle subsided, a Mormon Captain Butler gave a fiery speech. Butler announced loudly that he was a Mormon and that he was half white and was entitled to vote as a citizen as much as the next white person. With Mormons on both sides of the violence at the voting poll in Gallatin, one wonders if the voting day would have passed without interruption and violence, and maybe perhaps the Mormons and the Missourians could have resided in peace indefinitely. Was the entire Mormon Missouri War simply a manufactured war with pro-slavery mercenaries and volunteers causing the violence? This pattern of subterfuge and violence appears to be a sort of calling cards for the secret cult of Mormon assassins who still refer to themselves as the Danites. According to John D. Lee's confession, Lee had just been baptized Mormon in Daviess County and had just attended Mormon conference when he was invited to a secret meeting after the conference. This meeting appeared to be a secret Mormon military initiation ceremony. At this initiation, Lee states that he was taught secret military hand signs, which were to be used on the battlefield to recognize fellow Mormons who may be mistaken as Missourians. Lee describes how the sign was one of placing the right hand to the ear in a cupping fashion and then dropping it quickly to your side. The Mormon garments with its Masonic markings were also signs of recognition. When captured, a Mormon could rip open his shirt, revealing the garment in order to save himself from his Mormon assailants. So literally speaking, the Mormon garment was in fact designed to save the wearer's life, not from accidental catastrophe, but from death on the battlefield. Predicting local Missourians would block Mormons from voting, Lee and other Danite initiates were placed strategically around the polling booths. Lee said he lounged in the grass in view of the Gallatin poll. He recounts how he witnessed the Mormon attempt to enter the polls to vote, but were blocked by who he assumed was a Missourian ruffian. Rising to assault the Missourian, Lee was surprised when the Missourian flashed him that Mormon secret identification hand signal, which kept him from attacking the Mormon masquerading as Missourian. A scuffle breaks out, joined by the lounging Mormon watchers, including Lee, who jumped into the fray. Again, if we are to believe Lee in his confessions, John D. Lee claims that these Missourians who started the brawl by blocking a Mormon from voting were in fact Mormons pretending to be Missourians. In other words, the entire violent incident had been staged by Mormons, and it appears from most false flags was designed to trigger an actual war because was a Mormon identified as Captain Butler, who was, it seems from his speech, to be an interracial citizen, and thus was the reason for his being denied the vote. So you see, it was not due to Captain Butler being Mormon per se, but it was due to his race that he was prohibited from voting, which leads one to the conclusion that white Mormons may have been allowed to vote. This also leads to the conclusion that the Mormons staged this protest to send interracial Mormons into the polls to vote, even though at the time it was illegal for any interracial free black person to vote in the Missouri elections. This sort of peaceful civil disobedience against the illegal acts of an unfair law, such as the Jim Crow laws in the South, is a well-respected form of demonstrating against authority. Unfortunately, as it is found today in many protests, agent provocateurs are strategically placed to incite the crowd to violence. This occurred obviously in the Missouri War, where Mormons protesting against the voter suppression based on race ignited into a full violent war by the turncoat Mormon Danites, pretending to be violent Missourians. So both peaceful Mormons and peaceful Missourians are victims of these black-handed Red Brotherhood. They call themselves the Danites, and this is a brotherhood which appears to be global. And it's not just limited to the Mormon Danite Utahns. The facts described by an eyewitness to this violence, John D. Lee, has been systematically ignored by all historians. This is plainly written in John D. Lee's confessions, this complete false flag. Lee describes in a sober manner how he was initiated into a secret organization, taught secret identification signals, and for what purpose? Because Mormon Danites were being groomed to fight on both sides of the conflict, causing an upheaval in the Missouri, leading to insider Boggs issuing an extermination order, exiling all Mormons while Smith was held in jail. Smith was not only released when the last Mormon left the state of Missouri, but all the Mormon wealth was then looted by these greedy, carnivorous Boggs and company. Boggs was the son-in-law, yes, to Daniel Boone, another fake folk hero. Nathan Boone participated in the extermination of the Mormons, along with his brother-in-law, Boggs. It can be assumed he was pro-slavery. This is Daniel Boone, an advocate for the border ruffians conducted by um, the likes of General Atchison, General Doniphan, quote unquote, insiders, Mormon insiders. Well, they were Mormon Missourian insiders, not to Joseph Smith. They were traitors to Joseph Smith. These General Doniphan, which caused the blubbering of Jeffery Holland, and that Doniphan saved Joseph Smith from execution. Not, it was part of what you call a false flag theater done by the likes and a template well worn by these border ruffians and infiltrators and Mormon occult assassins. So what happened to Little Burn Boggs? Well, he later left the United States and slithered his greedy behind into the free state of California during the gold rush, which I'm sure he participated in the wholesale thievery characterized by the gold rush ruffians. His legacy is still felt today. The Central Valley in the gold rush country is filled with what you call white supremacists and Southern sympathizers who celebrate the South and the Confederate flag. Reenacting the Civil War is their favorite pastime, and to be General Lee is a prize indeed, coveted by all. Funny how General Lee escaped from the Civil War without a court-martial for treason or even the threat of an execution that is normally given to somebody of such high profile engaged in such treasonous activities. But as you recall, Lee is remembered as that fine old gentleman sipping mint juleps in his dotage as he watches the sun sink behind the horizon.